So the Treasure of KAFUR is a straight story of adventure set in Mughal India at the time of Akbar. The story commences about 200 years before with the finding, or let's say the burying of the treasure which has been recovered in large quantities by Malik Kafur, the slave general of Alauddin Khilji. That's the prologue. And then 250 years later, when the book begins, Akbar is on the throne of Hindustan, seemingly invincible. But his enemies have gotten to know the secret of the treasure, and the Mughal Empire faces its gravest threat yet. So this is the broad backdrop against which the book has been written. That's a good question. Let me say this, that the story is a fantasy, but relies on certain facts of history. We all know that Alauddin Khilji was the first of the Delhi sultans to actually invade the south. And when he sent Malik Kafur across the Vindhya mountains, to their amazement, they discovered that this place was full of treasure. And Kafur couldn't take everything back. So big was his booty that Khilji is supposed to have actually told Kafur, hide a large section of the treasure for some time so as to evade detection by robber bands and others who were harassing them all the time. So Kafur is supposed to have actually hidden the treasure. So to that extent, there is a certain historical backdrop. Some of the characters, like the character of Akbar, Rana Pratap, who come in the story, even Raja Man Singh to an extent, are drawn from folk accounts and actual historical accounts. But otherwise, there's a whole lot of other fantasy that comes into the story, including some animals that actually speak. So it's a story of fast-paced adventure involving a lot of characters, some of whom are actually historical, but others not so much. The treasure, the secret of the treasure of Kafur is actually with a grandmother who lives just south of the Tapti river, and her grandson. And in this household are also two ravens, a tortoise and a cow. When the king of Khandesh, which is one of the Deccan kingdoms that fears that Akbar is going to take it over, the king of Khandesh is the evil guy, is the bad guy in the book. He discovers that this woman, the old lady, knows the secret of the treasure of Kafur. And he sees this as the way to keep off Akbar and even take the fight to the Mughal Empire. So he kidnaps the old lady and imprisons her in his fortress of Asirgarh. The rest of the story is the adventure of the boy and the animals. They travel to Agra, meet the emperor under very dramatic circumstances, swing the emperor over to their cause, and Akbar then takes the field. So the main characters are the grandmother, the grandson, the animals, the Mughal emperor, and along the way we have very interesting characters of history, Rana Pratap Singh, Mirabai in a peripheral way, and one or two others also enter the story and make it what it is. See that, Indian history by and large, and certainly the Mughal period in particular, have a lot of fascination for me. So there's so much myth, there's so much folklore, there is so much interesting stuff that's happening right throughout Indian history and the Mughal period in particular, because Akbar looms over the Mughal era like a titan. He's a man with tremendous resonance and depth in his character, and he's also such a fantastic, it comes down in history as a tremendous monarch. So I started off with this feeling that I must do something around the period of Akbar, and particularly the Mughal era. And what, in my view, better than a buried or a lost treasure, and how it can threaten the entire Mughal Empire. And so in order to make it all happen, the idea of the animals also came up. And the way in which the animals are actually treated in the story, you might feel make it more suited for the younger audience, but it's not so. So for people who've read adult animal stories, this is like that. It appeals to people from the late teens going all the way up to adult, but anybody who enjoys fast-paced, nice action adventure, I'd say the Treasure of Kafur is for them. I'd say that as with any adventure story, or a thriller for that matter, authenticity of the backdrop helps. So for example, to understand how Agra Fort actually was, at the time, to understand the topography of India through which the boy and his animal friends travel. They travel almost what the Mughals would call 700-800 course, which is almost 2,000 kilometers they travel. So they travel through wilds of Hindustan, forests, the Chambal, before getting to Agra. So there is a lot of there is some physical description. Characters that come in are also authentic, up to a point in their own right. Great forts like Asirgarh, which are the scene of action, are also described from history. So yes, there's a certain amount of research, but I haven't overdone the research. Otherwise it can hang very heavily on what's essentially meant to be an enjoyable adventure, but enough to give it that authenticity that flows hopefully through the book. Very critical question. In fact, the more research you do, the more subconsciously you tend to build in details into the book, and actually readers react pretty badly to that. There is a subclass of reader who loves detail, but as someone who's written an earlier geopolitical thriller called The Shadow Throne before The Treasure of KAFUR is out, I can tell you that readers also are looking for movement in the book. The grandmother is kidnapped, she's threatened with torture, she has to be rescued quickly, the protagonists have to move forward in the story's action. Now, a lot of detail can clutter the action, can slow the book. You have to be very cautious not to do that. Provide just enough level of detail that the authenticity and the flavor of the period and everything is there as a backdrop in the mind of the author, in the mind of the reader, but never so that it starts to overwhelm him. So the heart of a thriller, in my view, is the imagination is gripped and the reader is pulled. The reader should never at this point stop and say, hey, you know what, this is getting a bit too much. The moment that happens and the thread is broken, I think it's hard to draw them back in. So I'd say that it's a fine line that every writer has to draw, and the only way the line can be drawn is to show it to a good critic, 2 or 3 of them, and they will tell you, you're overdoing it here or you're not doing it at all in certain other parts. So yeah, you see, the adventure happens because it's a boy of 20, right, and his animals. So it's a bit of a Mowgli Jungle Book kind of a feel to it at parts, and there is so much physical action in the book going forward. There is a lot happening, and there is also, during the book, I introduce a gang which are called the Taraks. The Taraks are followers of the demonist Tataka. Tataka appears in the Ramayana, and Rama slays her in the forest of Tataka. So there is a cult of Tataka, and it's a kind of a precursor to the cult of Tagi. So all these interesting add-on characters come and add to the menace and the sort of the thing of the story. So I felt that the grandmother is a focal point because she is kidnapped. She's taken for who she is. She's a seer, she's a spiritual person, and she's understood and lived with the treasure for many, many years. And she's understood its significance in a way that a much younger grandson cannot. So when she's kidnapped, she gives him clear instructions that he must seek out Akbar and convert Akbar to their cause. Otherwise, she will never be rescued and can become free. So it's just a way of structuring the story. I'd only say for my would-be readers that I think it's unusual to have this kind of a backdrop for an adventure story. I think it will hopefully break a little new ground. And for those who like to start and have a nice yarn that takes them right through to the end, I think The Treasure of KAFUR will work. I'd also like to just add a point that a well-written thriller in the quiet of your home on a rainy day is hard to beat. And if you're looking for that kind of a nice quiet afternoon where you can lose yourself, I'd like to think The Treasure of KAFUR is for you. I've also written a subcontinental contemporary thriller set in the post-Bin Laden assassination period called The Shadow Throne. And I think reader response has been so positive. Though it's a debut novel of mine, I'm very, very satisfied and gratified for that response. And I think, if anything, The Treasure of KAFUR will hopefully even build further on that. See, I basically run an applied material science company. You can't get more mundane than that, though I'm in the research and innovation field, so which is a little more creative, on the creative side of things. But I've been drawn to adventures and thrillers since my very, very young days. My father, to whom I've dedicated The Treasure of KAFUR, was my earliest teller of stories. So at night, we got back from school, and I used to have an early dinner, and at 8:30 to 9:30 was, before my bedtime, was my storytelling time. And he forced me to also tell stories to him. So my imagination was kindled at an early age, and I grew up then on Conan Doyle, earlier of course Enid Blyton, Biggles, and then Conan Doyle, and the great adventure authors of the late 19th century, the turn of the 20th century. So you had Rider Haggard, King Solomon's Mines, Alan Quatermain, Sapper on the Bulldog Drummond novels, Baroness Orczy, Scarlet Pimpernel. These were the authors on which I grew up and spent my early years. So some of my book has this slightly older style of writing in a sense. So it's not modern style of writing. But I decided early that my strength lay in the thriller adventure story as a genre. And I've continued with that, though I read a lot of non-fiction. So maybe I'll turn my mind to some interesting non-fiction later. But at the moment, the thriller and adventure as the genre is what appeals to me the most.